Yes, thank you, Sarah. Pleasure to be here. I'm an environmental and energy economist. I work on electricity markets, carbon markets, lots of transportation policy, and then deforestation and biodiversity. And I also teach courses here in energy markets and policy and climate and financial markets. So I want to talk to you today about electricity, because electricity is kind of the path to a green future, right? The plan is typically something like, let's electrify everything and then clean up the power grid as fast as we can. And that is a good idea, but there is some barrier. The way in which we price electricity is sometimes a bit counterproductive. So most residential and commercial customers actually pay a flat price for electricity, even though the actual cost of generation varies dramatically from hour to hour. Now, there is a pretty good textbook solution to this. It's called real-time pricing, where the price you pay would be fluctuating along with the cost of generation. And why is that efficient? Well, it would give you really good incentives, for example, in the summer, to put your thermostat a couple degrees higher when prices are high during a summer peak. It would also incentivize you to charge your car, your battery, or do your laundry during low price hours, say, in the middle of the day or at night. And that would allow more renewable energy to enter the grid. And moreover, the other benefit is that we make those extreme peaks a little less pronounced, so we don't have to build as many dirty peaker plants just to serve the grid, to keep it running for a couple hours a year. So there's lots of benefits to this. But then there's issues, and the big issue is it can be kind of scary to be in a real-time pricing plan. A couple of years ago in Texas, prices soared, and some consumers that had signed up for these plans were stuck with a $10,000 or more monthly electricity bill. So you can kind of imagine, for that reason, these pricing plans are not very popular. The question is, are there other kinds of pricing that can come to the rescue here? So the first option would be what's called time of use pricing. So basically, these are different electricity rates for different, let's say, times of the day or days of the week or seasons. You're pretty familiar with the easiest one, which is just peak versus off-peak pricing. Here you see an example from Pennsylvania. So the black dots are, you can sort of consider that these are wholesale prices, roughly speaking, the production cost of electricity for a given hour in a given location. The blue and the red lines are showing you a peak off-peak pricing plan, but you can see it's doing something to capture those peaks, but it's still pretty far off. So during the peaks, the price you pay is still way too low, and it still gives incentives to overconsume electricity. So a lot of people have already established in research that this simple peak off-peak pricing, it really misses what you're trying to capture. And what's worse, you need to set these prices in advance, so you might even get the average price wrong. So what utilities have been trying to do is to make these systems more and more sophisticated. So instead of peak off-peak, it's going to be a different price depending on the day of the week, the time of the day, even the season. And what I and co-authors have tried to do is try to see, does that really help to give efficient pricing signals? So we use data from all 7 major wholesale markets in the US, hourly pricing data, for the last decade. And what we're calculating, what I'm showing you here, is sort of what's the percent of the gain that you could get from real-time pricing that these time of use policies achieve. So you're looking at 4 different policies, from simple peak off-peak all the way to much more sophisticated. The different colors are the different markets in the US, different regions. And on average, the gain is kind of limited. It's about 10%, right? So this is not a magical solution. And what's worse, actually, if you make it more and more sophisticated, it seems to hurt more than it helps. So that current trend towards more sophistication is actually not helping very much at all. So what's the other option? The other option is critical peak pricing. It's something like you get a notification on your phone that, hey, tomorrow it's going to be really expensive to use electricity between 4 and 7 p.m. Be prepared. That is certainly helpful, that as you add more and more and more of those days, your utility can call more of those events. It's going to capture a higher percentage of the efficiency gains that real-time pricing could get you. But even with 20 of those days in the year, again, on average, you only capture about 10% of the gains from an efficient real-time pricing system. So the 2 systems together, the 2 systems that utilities actually use, can get you at most a fifth of the possible gains. So what else can we do? So here's what I would suggest, right? What you could try to do is take the sharpest edges off of real-time pricing. So in my Texas example, actually the wholesale price had skyrocketed to $9,000 per megawatt hour when a typical price is 40. What if we put consumers on real-time pricing, but we just cap it at, say, 75 or 100, which is nothing unusual. So this is not extreme. So as a consumer, you're protected from crazy prices when they would otherwise happen, but otherwise in most hours, you pay the right price for electricity. And we find that under those systems, capping it at 75, for example, gives you the vast majority of the benefits that full real-time pricing could get. So that's our proposal in this research. We think it's a very nice balance between protecting you from crazy prices, but still giving you the incentive to tweak your thermostat and charge your cars at the right times, and that'll also help increase renewable electricity penetration in the grid. So thank you for your attention, and I'll hand it over to the next speaker.
I want to talk about the efficiency of CO2 abatement. So how can we efficiently reduce the CO2 emissions that happen in the world? I'm going to start off, if you're a company trying to reduce CO2 emissions, right? A lot of companies have net zero goals or some other types of goals to reduce their emissions. I want to think about the efficiency of doing this. So one question you might ask is, should we as a company reduce our own emissions? For example, if you're a delivery company converting your cars or the trucks that you're using from gasoline cars to electric vehicles, or instead, should you buy offsets? Or something else, some other type of investment that could reduce CO2, right? What are the efficiency trade-offs that we're facing here? Offsets are really difficult to use in practice, right? We know that there's huge problems in terms of their verification, the additionality, lots and lots of articles about fraud in these cases. And so as a result, the SBTi corporate net zero standard, which basically defines the rules for companies who are trying to gain sustainability practices, trying to have these goals, it basically has said that you're not allowed to use carbon offsets to meet your sustainability goals. Right? This makes a lot of sense, right? Given the issues that we've seen, the lack of performance for a lot of offsets. But I still want to talk about why you might be interested in offsets, because I don't think we want to say this is completely not doable and we want to throw away offsets completely. I still want to think, how can we implement this, and why do we want to implement this? So I want to start there. Why should we implement offsets? Right? So suppose you're a delivery company and you're considering between changing your vehicle from a gasoline vehicle to an electric vehicle, or instead buying offsets for, let's say, a cook stove. Right? You can think, how much emissions would you reduce when you buy one of these things? So the classic thing for a gasoline vehicle, if you look at the EPA estimates, an average American household drives about 11,000 miles a year, 22 miles a gallon. So if you do the calculations, that's about 4 tons of CO2 per year. Right? In the best case scenario, if you have a grid that's completely run on renewables, you could say that emits 0 tons of CO2. It's often actually less, right? We still have fossil fuels on our grid. You can compare that with a charcoal stove. The average Kenyan household uses about 800 kilograms of charcoal per year doing their breakfast, lunch, and dinner cooking. And that emits about 9 tons of CO2 per year. If they buy a different type of charcoal stove that is much more efficient, that only emits 4 tons of CO2. So the reduction here is the same, right? Both of these technologies reduce emissions by 4 tons of CO2 per year. The one on the left costs, let's say, $10,000 more than a regular vehicle. The one on the right costs about $30 more, right? These are the efficiency differences that we're talking about, right? If you're going to spend $10,000, you could reduce a lot more CO2 if you spend that on improved stoves than if you spend that on cars, right? And about 4 billion people in the world still cook with these types of stoves. So there's massive opportunities for these types of technologies to be replaced. Right, so this is the efficiency problem. There's lots of different technologies that you can think about here, right? So here you're just taking the tons of CO2 and the dollar cost, you put a ratio to that. So how many dollars do you have to spend to reduce 1 ton of CO2? You can compare across all these different technologies, wind production, hybrid vehicles, sustainable aviation fuel, right? You can flip this the other way around. If you were going to spend $1 million, how much CO2 would you take out of the atmosphere? And you can see just the differences here across technologies in terms of like the actual CO2 that comes out of the atmosphere. Right? So this is the goal of offsets. So I agree that there's huge issues with offsets, right? The current offset market is incredibly problematic. But I also don't want us to lose sight of just the size of the differences in the amount of CO2 reductions that we can achieve if we find a way to do this effectively. So I want to think about that. I'm going to throw out a crazy idea here, which is never actually going to happen, but just as food for thought, right? The FDA is an organization that basically says, these are the drugs that you can buy. You go to a store, you can only buy the drugs that have undergone really rigorous evaluation by an independent researcher that says this particular drug or this particular technology actually does what it says on the tin, right? So in this case, selling carbon offsets should require approval by an independent agency. It should require rigorous and independent evaluation. We don't want to rely on the companies themselves to provide information. We know that they're going to cook the books if they're allowed to do that. You should have full disclosure on what I'm going to call side effects. Right? In this case, cook stoves can also have really good anti-poverty benefits. They can have local air pollution benefits. Different technologies can have positive side effects or negative side effects. We should be fully informed about all of these. And then given that that's the case, now people can choose from among the cheapest options, and we can maximize the CO2 reductions. So, of course, you're thinking like, well, that sounds really expensive, this climate FDA. But just to emphasize the differences here, right? The amount of money that you're going to spend on these different technologies, there is so much money that you could spend, even if you like doubled the cost of basically, you could make this number a lot bigger. You could spend a lot more money on a really rigorous, massive climate FDA, and still that would be a lot better than just getting rid of offsets altogether. So that's my pitch. If you're a student here and you're wondering what to do, I will encourage you to work on developing cheaper climate innovation so that we can maximize the amount of CO2 that comes out of the atmosphere. We want to maximize our impact. If you're thinking about what to fund the stuff that gets the most CO2 out of the atmosphere. And finally, we want to invest in quality standards. These are going to be really costly if you want to do them right, but they're easily going to be worth the money. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Well, it's great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. It's an honor to be with this crowd of professors, and I want to thank the ESG initiative in particular for supporting this research. So I am a real estate and finance professor. I think that studying the housing market in the United States is the most important market for understanding households and understanding the macroeconomy. For most households, the house is their largest asset. The mortgage is their largest liability. The housing market you can think of as being about $32 trillion in home equity and about $14 trillion in mortgage debt. What happens in the housing market deeply and substantively affects where the macroeconomy goes, to the point where macroeconomists have written papers that say the housing market is the business cycle. And in thinking about how this ties into climate, I came to this a few years ago now thinking about these investments that households have made. They've made very large investments. Their most important investment in something that is durable, illiquid, immovable, right? Deeply exposed to the risks of a place, of a specific location. And when you talk to buyers or you talk to mortgage lenders, they say, well, that's the insurance industry's problem. The insurance industry is going to deal with the issues of climate change, and we don't need to think about it. And so we said, okay, well, that's interesting. Let's dig into the insurance market, try to understand what's going on there. And what my co-author Phil and I ran into is that there's no data on the insurance industry. It's very difficult to figure out what are homeowners actually paying in homeowners insurance. And so we set out to solve that problem with this project. And what we did is we created a new data set of how much homeowners are paying in their mortgage, in their homeowners insurance, and we backed it out from their mortgage payments. So most of you are not homeowners, but those of you who are will know this, or your parents will know this, which is when you make a mortgage payment, you're not just paying the principal and interest on the mortgage, you're also paying your taxes and you're paying your insurance. And that is paid through an escrow account, a third party that makes sure that those bills get paid on time. Your mortgage lender really wants to make sure that you're current on your insurance. so that they're protected and that you're current on your property taxes. We were able to back this out of an enormous data set of 12.4 million mortgages, over 47 million premiums backed out from these escrow payments from 2014 to 2023. And this project gives us unprecedented detail and unprecedented insight with granular geography at the zip code level about how much homeowners are paying in their insurance. So this is one of the big payoffs to the research, which is a map like this, which as far as we know has never been made before this project. And we were really lucky that the New York Times was interested in this as well. So they made a version of this map over the summer, which is way prettier than my map. So you can go on the New York Times website, and their data visualization people are really good at this. There's a few things that jump out looking at 2023 homeowners insurance premiums. Obviously, Florida and the Gulf Coast is extremely expensive for insurance, very exposed to climate risk like the back-to-back hurricanes that we've just seen. But you see some other places like eastern Colorado, and then Tornado Alley, Oklahoma and North Texas, where when you talk to folks there, they say hail and tornadoes have gotten so severe and so unpredictable that a lot of insurance providers are actually leaving the state. They're not offering policies anymore, and that's driving up the cost of premiums. With this enormous data set in hand, we're now developing a number of research projects. The first one that we're thinking about is, this is my other map that I was going to show you. I'll show you this one first. This is Miami. So now we can drill down to the zip code level, and you can see, within Miami-Dade County, South Beach is in red here, over $8,000 per year if you want to have homeowners insurance on South Beach. You're probably happy to pay that if you live on South Beach. That's rounding error to you. But for a lot of households in these other parts of Miami, this is an enormous burden. If you look at this over time, what you see is a dramatic spike in insurance premiums starting around late 2020, early 2021. A number of explanations for this related to inflation. Change from a zero interest rate world to a non-zero interest rate world drove up insurers' cost of capital. Inflation drove up the cost of repairs, the cost of materials, the cost of labor. There's also some capacity issues in the reinsurance market that have made pricing very difficult for a homeowner, the primary market. What we show in the paper is that this growth has been disproportionate in the most climate-exposed parts of the country. And so this is the last thing I'll leave you with, is if you think about the relationship between disaster risk and the price that you pay for insurance, what we show is that that was basically constant from 2014 through 2020. There was basically no change, a 1 standard deviation increase in the riskiness of your location based on the National Risk Index corresponded with about a $300 increase in your premium. Now that's over $500. And so, what is a standard deviation of the risk index? Well, think of New Orleans. New Orleans is 4 standard deviations above the average in the US. That means that New Orleans residents pay about $2,000 more for homeowners insurance. And so if you're thinking about what's going to spur adaptation in this market, $14 trillion of mortgages, $32 trillion of home equity, it's this, right? It's the rising cost of disaster risk. This is what's going to spur adaptation. It's going to spur investment in resilience efforts, and it's ultimately going to spur retreat from the riskiest areas. I'm out of time, so I'll stop there. One very brief note outside of this. I'm teaching a brand new class this spring that's called Data Analytics in Real Estate. And so if you're interested, it's a half semester course, and I hope to see many of you there. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks to all of you for being here. So I'm a little bit different than I think most of the other professors here. I'm a philosopher. I don't do empirical work. I don't deal with data or run studies or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is just talk through a kind of argument that I'm developing that raises some questions about the promise of the kind of ESG movement for helping us to deal with the climate crisis. So we all know ESG is getting a lot of attention. There's a fair bit of enthusiasm for it. But we should ask, how might we expect it to actually help us do everything that is necessary, or at least what we can reasonably expect of it, to deal with the climate crisis. So in order to think about this, we have to know first, well, what is ESG? And there are actually kind of competing views about how we should understand it. So one, which you kind of hear a fair bit in response to some of the kind of conservative criticisms of ESG, is that, look, ESG is not incompatible with profit maximization. In fact, it kind of relies on it and just requires that we take into account in an appropriate way the risks that kind of environmental considerations present to, for example, certain kinds of investments. So on this sort of view, being committed to ESG principles would require that we kind of take into account the risks associated with, for example, investing in coastal property in Florida because that property might end up underwater in a few decades. But it doesn't require that we, for example, commit, if we're business decision makers, to kind of reducing our firm's emissions, even when doing that would come at the expense of kind of expected returns on investments. So I think it's pretty clear that there are severe limits to the prospects of kind of this version of ESG helping us to generate significantly reduced emissions from business decision making. One reason for that, which I won't be able to kind of explain in detail, has to do with the way in which climate change is a collective action problem, right? No individual firm would stand to kind of benefit on net from its own individual emissions reductions to an extent that could justify, from a profit maximizing perspective, emissions reductions when emissions would be profitable otherwise, right? Collective action problems kind of generally have this structure. Climate change kind of features this in a way that makes it the case that self-interested reasons alone are not generally going to count strongly in favor of unilateral reductions. So the alternative view is that ESG does actually require some sacrifice of profits, or prospective profits, but then we face a whole bunch of difficult questions, right? So which shifts away from profit maximization are required and why? These are ethical questions, right? We need rigorous kind of moral arguments to think through them. And one of the ways that ESG, I think, prevents the kind of systematic analysis that we need is that it combines these different kinds of factors, right? The environmental, the social, the governance, into this kind of mishmashed metric, which really amounts to kind of a broad range of possible metrics, right? I mean, there are these sort of different metrics that are out there that combine the factors in different ways, that weigh some more heavily than others, without really kind of there being a whole lot of discussion out there about why we might have kind of good reasons to assign more weight to one thing rather than another, and so on. So I think in light of this, there's reason to think that what we need instead, or at least in combination with many of the efforts that kind of fall under the ESG umbrella, is something more like what we might call environmental business ethics, that focuses specifically on climate, right? And looks at questions like, what's the appropriate distribution of the burdens of emissions reductions on firms across the economy, taking into account things like the various benefits that different kinds of business activity promote, and the capacities of different kinds of firms to engage in reductions without costing too much in the way of things that we as a society and as a world have reason to care about. All right, I'll end there. Thanks. Oh, well, okay, so I'll conclude by giving a pitch for my courses for the spring. So I teach both the required, or the LGST 1000 course that's one of the ways of satisfying the kind of core requirement in legal studies, and also a course called International Business Ethics, which looks at global issues, including climate change. So that's a course that you might look into, and I'd love to have you.
I decided that I would present on a single paper that is hopefully in the last round of reviews and will soon be published. And this is joint work with scholars at the Lab and Indiana University. And really what this is actually is a continuation of the topic that I came here to talk to you about last year, and that is the topic of energy poverty and energy insecurity. Now, this refers to when a household struggles to pay their energy bills or to keep the house warm enough or cool enough for them to be comfortable and to survive. Now, when a household cannot power or when a household does not have access to electricity or can't afford it, they can't run devices, which means you wouldn't be able to use your computers in here. You wouldn't be able to use your phone to seek information or assistance. You can't run a refrigerator, which means you can't keep perishable and healthy food. Without electricity, you can't run an electronic medical device, which millions of households rely on every day for their livelihoods, for their lives. And you might not be able to keep your body warm or cool, which can lead to a variety of mental and physical health outcomes, including in the very extreme but not at all rare case can lead to death. Now, I'm particularly interested in solutions to energy insecurity and energy poverty within the United States context in particular, and I've been working on several projects thinking about preventative measures for energy insecurity. That is, how do we help households avoid ever entering the state of being insecure or ever becoming disconnected from their service provider? Now, I have a variety of studies. Hopefully one is that I can present next year is on a randomized controlled trial, a field trial that we're implementing with weatherization and electrification in multifamily dwelling units. But the project that I want to focus on for my remaining 3 minutes is on the integration of solar, residential solar. And the question is whether residential solar can help reduce the incidence of energy insecurity. So what we've done essentially is we've taken this fabulous data set of all solar owners across the United States. I'll just go ahead and click so you can see the data here. And we've taken this data set and we've identified all solar owners in the United States that adopted solar in the year 2021. And we have household characteristics for them, socio-demographic characteristics, housing condition characteristics, information about the climate zone and the region. And we've taken all these observable characteristics and essentially we have matched to the best of our ability the solar households with other households that don't have solar but look identical on all observed characteristics. So we've used this matching technique essentially to identify every household that we want to study, and then we sent surveys to all of these households. And in the surveys, we asked questions about their solar panels, whether they had incentives for their solar panels, as well as a suite of questions on energy insecurity. Now, here are the results. We asked several different questions. There's a lot of outcome variables that one could use for energy insecurity. Questions such as, can you pay your energy bill? Have you ever received a notice for disconnection? Do you need to reduce your energy consumption? Do you need to keep your household at an uncomfortable temperature? And do you need to forego other expenses to pay for your energy bills? Now, you can look at the main specification here in black, but then also note that we've run a variety of other specifications, robustness checks, adding in more control variables, pulling out or adding in the pilot responses, recategorizing according to income, looking at just households that align within a county, and dropping those that we think identify as slightly higher income than we had originally tried to identify when we looked at our low to moderate income sample. Now, here's the results in just bar graph form. We find that households with solar are 46% less likely to receive a disconnection notice, 44% more likely to be able to pay their energy bill, 34% less likely to forego other necessary expenses, 21% less likely to keep their home at an uncomfortable temperature, and 15% less likely to reduce their energy consumption. Now, we also find that the benefits of solar spill over into other bills, specifically other energy bills. Here, first, we find that solar owners pay, or save rather, on average $65 per month as a result of having that solar. But we also find that it enhances their ability to pay for other forms of energy. Since most households don't just typically have just electricity, they might have electricity and gas, for example, or electricity and wood or propane. Now here are the regression results. If you look at the solar line, you can see that if you have residential solar, it makes it the case that you are less commonly in a situation where you can't pay your gas bill, for example. And at the 10% significance threshold, we can see that it also helps households pay for wood and propane. I'll go ahead and stop there. No, I won't. My classes. I'm teaching a class, since we're allowed the liberty to do this, I'm teaching a class this fall on effective energy policy for the energy transition. And in the spring semesters, I teach a class on energy justice. Thank you.
I'm really excited to talk about this today. I'm also going to follow suit and just pitch you a single paper that I've been working on right now. So I write a lot about municipal bonds. These are the main instrument in the US by which state, local, cities, school districts, they're going to invest in durable public assets. It's a really, really big market, and it is one of the key ways in which we're going to invest in the US in climate resiliency and in lowering greenhouse gas emissions. So I think this market's important. It's about a $4 trillion market. To give you a size, so not as big as the mortgage market, but it's a pretty big market. It's going to finance basically any time that there's a new school building or a new water system or a new public asset that is built, a new courthouse, whatever, is going to be financed with a municipal bond. And so if we think this is one of the core ways in which we're going to be investing in climate resilience and in lowering greenhouse gas emissions, we would expect this to be a very, very common place for green bonds to exist. But if we actually look at, so one of the things that will happen when you're issuing a bond, which is of course a promise to pay investors who are going to give you cash to invest in the asset you want to build, lots of these are going toward kind of green projects, but the self-labeling of green bonds is quite rare. So if we look in the data, about 4.5% of the funding raised in 2022 was issued as a self-labeled green bond. And there are a few more sustainability bonds and a few more social bonds, but it's still not a very big portion of the market. So we're wondering, is climate investment not happening? Or are there reasons in the financial market why we might not be labeling our debt as green? Is it because investors don't care about the greenness of their bonds? So one of the things that we noticed when we started looking through these green bonds is that they're really issued primarily in the richest places in the US. That it's mostly kind of California and New York where we see green bonds being issued. And there is some evidence that they receive favorable pricing. And so I want to ask first, why don't others issue green bonds? And maybe are there no related projects that they're investing in? Are there political constraints? Are there financial constraints? Is it the fact that just nobody cares about these bonds? So what makes that tricky is the bonds are being used to finance all sorts of different projects. But so what happened last year in March that has been very lucky is that there's a nice natural experiment in that Bloomberg started listing for about 127,000 bonds around the US what the relative ESG characteristics of these bonds are. And then particularly what was important is they wound up giving a official verified opinion on whether the bond would be a green bond, a sustainability bond, or a social bond. And so I'll just kind of show you what this looks like on Bloomberg. I know it's kind of small, but bear with me. In the far left column, we see little green leaves on Bloomberg. This means that the bond self-verified as a green bond. And so we can see here in this sample of bonds I'm showing you, 3 of them have been verified as green bonds, one of which is this California Community Choice Financing Authority. What happened on March 6th of 2023 is they added this column here, and actually a few other columns on the right, about the ESG characteristics of these bonds. And what we can see is, essentially, this is not exact, but it's close, that about above a 4 is going to be kind of would qualify as a green or sustainability bond, below a 4 wouldn't. And so what we can see is, yes, that California Community Choice Financing Authority, it's going to be a community college financing authority. Yes, it would have qualified as a green bond under this new Bloomberg measure. But the other Mount San Antonio Community College District just above it also issued a bond that qualifies as a green bond by international standards, that is being used to engage in climate resilience and greenhouse gas emissions. It scores very highly, but it wasn't self-selected as a green bond. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to engage in a very classic, what we call it a difference in difference analysis, where I'm going to compare the pricing of the bonds that self-labeled as green, and I'm going to compare that to the pricing of the bonds that didn't self-label as green, but then became verified as green through this process. And so what I can see is basically, first, did investors care and are they willing to pay more for these sort of green bonds? So I'm going to compare this Mount San Antonio bond to the California Community Choice bond, which was already labeled as green, and say, what happens? And so this is I'm going to show you from 2021 to 2023. I'm going to show you the spreads relative to a maturity matched treasury. And so this is a measurement of how much does it cost a municipality to raise financing for their projects. And so we can see within bond that these green bonds that I'm going to call ex post green and sustainability bonds, so from the end we see they were green and sustainable. They had differential pricing that I'm going to difference out. Then Bloomberg started selling this information to some select institutional investors. And then on March, when they started announcing this information, we can see a robust 3 basis point increase in decrease in the spread, or a premium that investors are willing to pay for these bonds relative to other bonds. So we see investors do care about this information. They particularly care about it for green and sustainability bonds. I'll highlight we can also show the same thing for just social bonds that don't have any climate impact. And we don't actually find the same impact here. So it seems that investors really do care about the climate impact and not just kind of some broad, ambiguous ESG characteristic, but they really, really care about the climate impact. And as a final kind of interesting puzzle, many of these bonds that would qualify as green or sustainable or social are also issued by relatively rich and credit-worthy places. Somewhat weirdly, one of the largest beneficiaries, or the largest beneficiary we're able to find of this additional information that Bloomberg reported, is bonds that don't qualify as green bonds or sustainability bonds or social bonds, but that get information and didn't have a good credit rating. So low credit rating issuers seem to find this information and show that it's very complementary to something about credit risk. So here I'm going to show different bonds. The blue line is the one I want you to look at. This is bonds that don't qualify as green bonds, that have low credit ratings, and Bloomberg comes out and announces, hey, this doesn't qualify as a green bond. That announcement of information seems to lead to much more beneficial pricing for these bonds and lower borrowing costs in an order of magnitude of about 12 basis points. So I think we're finding that investors do care about the greenness of their bonds, and not just for the bonds that actually qualify as green bonds under some international standard, but that this disclosure is very, very important for being seen as complementary to other material considerations about the creditworthiness of the borrowers. So thank you so much for your time. I'll pass it on.
Thank you. It's really great to be with all of you. I want to learn a lot more about climate change, and I've got a short attention span, so this is kind of the perfect event of the year for me. I really do look forward to it. I want to tell you about a new paper of mine called Carbon Burden. The question that we're after in this paper is, how large are the negative externalities from corporate greenhouse gas emissions? Now, the perspective we bring that's new to this question is we're thinking very hard about the future. We're thinking about what's going to happen to greenhouse gas emissions in the future. And we think it's important to think about the future, because if you want to understand how bad global warming is going to be, you need to think a lot about what's going to happen to emissions in the future. The way we're going to measure these negative externalities from carbon pollution is with a new concept that we call carbon burden. Before introducing carbon burden, let me relate it to something that we're all more familiar with, firm value. Let me take you back to Finance 101 and remind you that the formula we use to measure firm value is here. We want to think about every year T into the future. We want to forecast out the firm's cash flows in that year, and we want to discount them back to today with some discount rate R. So firm value we interpret as being the present value of future cash flows. It's the value of the firm to its shareholders through the firm's profits. How big is firm value in the United States? Well, if you sum up equity value across all U.S. corporations, you get a huge number, $66 trillion. Carbon burden looks similar in certain ways, okay? With carbon burden, we're also thinking about every year T in the future. We're also discounting things back to today at some discount rate R, but what we're discounting is not cash flows of a firm. We're discounting emissions times SCC. So emissions, this is our forecast of how much is this company going to be emitting greenhouse gases in that future year T. SCC stands for the social cost of carbon. This is a number that policymakers and scholars use to translate a given amount of emissions measured in tons into a dollar value that's measuring the cost to society for each given ton of carbon pollution. So the interpretation of carbon burden is that this is the present value of the social costs from future greenhouse gas emissions. So it's, in a sense, it's the value of the firm, or it's a negative value of the firm to society, not to shareholders, but to society through the company's pollution activities. And we're curious in the study, like, how big of a number is this? So we measure carbon burden for every single large firm in the US. We measure it for every industry in the US. But the only numbers that I'm going to show you today are for the US in total, for US corporations in total. How big is this carbon burden? So to answer that, we need to put numbers on these things. For emissions, we're going to rely on forecasts by experts. The experts in our government at the Energy Information Administration who are forecasting emissions of the US corporate sector way out into the future. For social cost of capital, again, we're relying on the experts at the Environmental Protection Agency who are forecasting this SCC way out into the future. And for discount rates, we're going to use a range of values, kind of taking advice from researchers in this area. So, you know, the drum roll would be, well, the number we get out of this is very big. We're finding that the carbon burden of the US corporate sector is $57 trillion. That's like more than 10 times larger than what we expected going into this. What we're finding is that the value, or the cost of companies to society through their pollution is about 85% the size of the equity value of those firms to their shareholders. It's just another way to see just how big this climate crisis is.
It's been great to see all the research that's presented here. I think it's so important that we're not just taking data off the shelf on a company's performance, but we're coming up with novel data, novel approaches, asking the real questions about how climate affects corporate value and the impacts it has, and questioning whether we're looking at it the right way, as Brian did. One of the challenges we face when we look at the impact that firms are having is firms often deceive us. Firms often say one thing and do another. And that's something that I look at in this paper with some of my co-authors, including a former doctoral student here who's now at Rutgers, a visiting professor here, and a colleague at UT Austin. We're looking at whether firms who say they care about environment actually follow through. And that's really hard because we can't always observe what they do. And so we're going to ask whether a company like Verizon here, who says they want to move forward sustainably and puts out this really glossy and nice ESG report that makes all these claims, says that they are really concerned about this, do they actually follow up? And we're going to do that by looking at the way that they lobby, the way that they influence the policy environment, which is actually really hard to do because firms often don't have to disclose or divulge to the public how they lobby and the direction in which they lobby. Now, Verizon, who has all these wonderful claims in their sustainability reports, actually lobbied on HB 1355 concerning the creation of producer responsibility program for statewide recycling, and they lobbied to support this bill in the state of Colorado, somewhat consistent with their policies. Now, it would be nice if that was the norm. Unfortunately, it's not. And we're going to show that through a systematic large data analysis, pulling together data that other people haven't had. So the way we're going to do this is in 5 states, including Colorado, every corporation that lobbies a public entity, a regulator, a legislator, has to not only disclose that they lobbied, but they also have to disclose the bill they lobbied on and the direction of change that they wanted. Did they support it or did they oppose it? And all that is available through state disclosure of various degrees of transparency and ease of scraping. So we figure out whether they support or they oppose different bills. Our data set comprises 388,000 declarations across 33,890 bills over 6 years that we match to over 5,000 firms that were part of the S&P 1500 or Russell 3000 over a 10-year period. Over 500 firms lobbied in at least one of these states across over 7,500 bills. And we want to see whether their declarations and their sustainability reports line up with the way they lobbied. The way we capture the claims is developing a vocabulary, building on prior research, mining or analyzing their annual reports and their sustainability reports for these kinds of words that connote attention to the climate. Air quality, alternative fuel. I'll spare you reading every word on the list, but you get the gist, that we're looking at how much they talk about these issues in their sustainability reports, and then we see on what they lobby. Now, in order to do the lobbying, we have to code each of those thousands of bills as to whether they're pro-environment or anti-environment. So the way we do that is we first look at whether they're talking about certain words like climate, energy, the same kind of analysis. And then we look to see we look to code each of these based on whether they're in favor or against those, again using text analysis. And then importantly, coding whether a firm opposes or supports a bill that is pro or anti-energy, anti-climate regulation, and coming up with a measure of consistency between their environmental lobbying and their environmental claims. Now the punchline, I could show you a lot of regressions and a lot of fancy statistics, but the punchline of our analysis is that for the hundreds of firms in our sample, there's absolutely no correlation between the text content of their sustainability reports and the way they're lobbying at the state level. No correlation, okay? So you can't believe what they say. But there's a little bit of good news. The ESG initiative sponsors the Zicklin Index for Corporate Political Accountability. It's a way of rating firms on the degree of disclosure of their corporate political activity and also their governance of their lobbying activity. For the firms that have the highest standards of disclosure of their corporate political activity and have a common board level oversight for sustainability and lobbying, the correlation is positive, significant, and robust. So the implication here is we should be demanding that firms disclose how they lobby, according to the Zicklin Center of Corporate Transparency and Political Accountability, and we should be demanding better corporate governance of these firms so that they're not saying one thing on one hand and doing something on the other. In subsequent research, we show this isn't just a moral or an ethical point. The firms that lack the correlation between what they say and what they do are more likely to be sued, more likely to be called in for a regulatory hearing or a regulatory investigation. So there's a material cost to the inconsistency. So let's hold them accountable, let's demand transparency, and let's increase those costs for inconsistency. As a final word, if I have 30 seconds, I also teach 2 courses this spring. At the undergraduate level, it's Management 2090, the political and social environment of the multinational firm. At the MBA level, it's Management 7200, corporate diplomacy. It allows you to understand how firms engage with their stakeholders, derive value from that, engage in strategic communications, and drive change within their organizations to align societal and shareholder value. And I see a couple of former alum of the class in the room, so it's great to have you back and see your interest here. Thanks very much.